Number 3, the domain of this function are the values that we are allowed to drop input into the function. So what are we allowed to put into this function? Well, we should know that we cannot take the square root of a negative number. It just doesn't work because of the definition. So that means that what we're taking the square root of must be positive, which, as you know, can also be expressed by saying that it must be greater than 0, which means that what we're taking the square root of, which is 3x minus 12, must be bigger than 0. So when we add 12 to both sides and then divide both sides by 3, we can see that what we're allowed to put into the function we're dropping in x, that input must be bigger than 4, and that is the domain. All right, let's take a look at g of x's domain. So we are inputting x into the function g, and what are we allowed to put into this function? Well, what's happening to it is it's getting squared. We can square anything. We can square positive numbers and negative numbers. We can square 0. We can square fractions and decimals. There's nothing we can't square. Therefore, if the domain means what are we allowed to put into this function, the domain of this function is that our input, in this case x, can be anything, can be any real number. And that's our domain. Sometimes I see students saying, all real numbers. Well, I want you to tell me that we're talking about x. X can be any real number. In algebra, sometimes we'll use this symbol, which is like this half circle with a line in the middle. X can belong to the set of real numbers. It can be any element from that set. All right, well, let's move on to parts C and D. Now we're asking about the range of these functions. We had an extra g there. I erased that extra g, so now it reads correctly. All right, we're asking about the range, and we can figure out the range by considering what the domain is. If the domain is what we're allowed to put into the function, values of x, in this case, have to be bigger than or equal to 4. And the range is asking what kind of values are allowed to come out of the function. Well, what comes out is the square root of 3 times your input minus 12. What are those values going to be? Use the boundary from your domain to figure out what the boundary for the range is going to be. What do we mean by that? Write out the output, square root of 3 times x minus 12. For the x value, put in this boundary from our domain. So our range looks like the values are going to be square root of 12 minus 12, which is the square root of 0, which is 0. So write out that boundary of 4. When you drop 4 into this function, this ends up being equal to 12. Well, x, that's just the boundary. So our output is a boundary of 0, but x is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and as it does, this 12 is going to become bigger, and 12 minus 12 is going to be bigger than 0. It's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So our range are going to be values that are at the smallest 0, but they're going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. The way we can say that is range f of x values start at 0, but then they get bigger and bigger and bigger. So the f of x values, which is the output, this whole thing is output, those values are bigger than or equal to 0. And that's our range. All right, let's take a look at g of x, which is this function. Well, ask yourself what can come out of this function. What can go in can be anything, but what comes out? Can we ever get 0 to come out? It would have to be 8 plus negative 8. Can 2x squared ever be equal to 0? And I hope you say, well, no, because when you square something, you always get a positive result. So this will always be positive. What's the smallest 2x squared can be? If you can put anything in, what's the smallest this can be? If you put in really small negative numbers, when you square them, they're positive again. So the smallest this can be will always be positive. Can it ever get down to 0? Sure, if your input is x equals 0, 2 times 0 squared is 2 times 0, which is 0. So the smallest this can be is 0. And if we're always adding 8, then the smallest this function can be is 8. And that's our range. The range is that our g of x values have to always be at least 8. And that's it for number 3. All right, let's go on and talk about number 4 then. All right, P of B will be your total pay for the week. Well, you earned $500 for the week, plus a commission for every bike you sell. So we're going to increase our pay by $200 for every bike that we sell. And B is the number of bikes we sell. So we'll multiply the number of dollars per bike times the number of bikes. That's it for part A. All right, the domain of this function is what values are we allowed to input. So B is the number of bikes you can sell, and that's what's being dropped into function P. So what are we allowed to put in? It says that due to limited inventory, the most bikes you can sell in any given week is 14. You might get skunked and sell 0 bikes, but at most you'll sell 14. So our domain says the number of bikes you can sell, B, can be anywhere from 0 to 14. The number of bikes we can sell have to be bigger than 0, or they could be equal to 0. You might get skunked. So don't read 0 and then less than or equal to B. Start with B. So this says that B has to be bigger than 0 or equal to 0, but B also has to be less than or equal to 14. Since this tells us what values of B we are allowed to input into our function, this is the domain. What about the range? The range says what's going to come out. As you know, what comes out is P of B. P, your total pay, and it depends on how many bikes you sold. So we say that your pay is P of B. And P of B, the output, can be anywhere from you didn't sell any bikes, but you still do earn $500 per week. So remember, you can just take this boundary value, 0 from your domain, and use it to find your range's boundary value. Input 0 into our function for P, and we have 500 plus 200 times 0. So you didn't make any commission, you just made your $500. So the very smallest amount of money you're going to make, your pay is greater than or equal to $500. And the most money you can make is when you sell 14 bikes. So when we input 14 into our P function to find our pay, how much money do we make? 500 plus $200 times 14 bikes, which is $2,800, for a total of $3,300. So our pay has to be less than or equal to $3,300, but more than or equal to $500, and that is our range.